The sun rose over Constantinople, pale and trembling behind a veil of smoke and fog, as if the city itself feared the day. In the grand marketplaces, the laughter of children and the shouts of merchants had vanished, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against the ears. Torches guttered in the wind along the marble colonnades, casting trembling shadows over empty streets. The scent of incense, once used to honor the gods, mingled now with the stench of death. It clung to the city like a heavy shroud. In the imperial palace, Emperor Justinian stood at the balcony, the weight of the world etched into the lines of his face. His eyes, once burning with the ambition to restore the glory of Rome, now reflected only despair. He had commanded armies, built churches, written laws, yet here he was powerless, as if the very air had turned traitor. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, their faces pale, their bodies trembling, not with fear of rebellion, but of a sickness that spared no rank or title. The plague had come, silent and unstoppable, and it had claimed the strongest and the weakest alike. The first screams came at dusk. From the narrow alleys near the harbor, a woman's cries pierced the cold air, echoing off the stone walls. Her child had fallen ill overnight, fevered and convulsing, and there was no healer who could save him. From there, the sound multiplied. The wailing of the bereaved, the hollow groans of the dying, the mournful toll of church bells calling for prayers that went unanswered. Horses, once symbols of status and power, wandered the streets alone, their hooves clattering against cobblestones slick with rain and blood. The city, for all its might, became a mausoleum. Merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving behind coins tarnished by grime, bread rotting in baskets, and silks dulled by dust. The docks, once alive with the chatter of sailors and the smell of spices from distant lands, now lay empty. Ships drifted unattended, their sails torn, their decks littered with cargo no one would claim. And yet the plague did not care for ships or walls. It moved faster than men could flee. It crept into the homes of the rich and poor alike, a shadow that no candle could banish. In the streets, bodies were dragged into the open, stacked like firewood. Families huddled together, whispering prayers into the ears of loved ones who could no longer hear. Some tried to flee the city, hoping the walls would not hold them captive in this nightmare. But the plague traveled with them, a phantom unseen, claiming life with impartial cruelty. Fear became as pervasive as air itself, and suspicion followed close behind. Neighbors turned away from one another, hands shaking at the thought of touch, eyes darting in suspicion. Even the most devout wondered if the gods had abandoned them, if the prayers and sacrifices had been nothing more than whispers against a storm that would not relent. Amid this despair, the army faltered. Legion after legion, soldiers fell not to swords, but to the invisible hand of disease. Fortifications once impregnable were left manned by ghosts, silent sentinels whose numbers dwindled daily. Trade slowed to a trickle, and the wealth of Byzantium, its silks, its gold, its grain, withered in warehouses untended. The empire, already strained by wars and ambition, felt the grip of mortality tighten around its heart. Scholars and scribes recorded the devastation with trembling hands, aware that history would judge them, but powerless to stop the tide. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the great church that gleamed like a jewel over the city, priests moved through the shadows, chanting prayers that dissolved into the air. The faithful knelt where they could, pressing beads and palms to the cold stone, seeking solace that never came. Their eyes, hollow and red from weeping, met the faces of the dead as they were carried past on carts, blankets concealing bodies whose names would be forgotten. The very faith that had once united a city now seemed fragile, fragile as smoke, drifting toward an uncertain sky. And yet, in the midst of the horror, life clung stubbornly. Mothers cradled the sick, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. Children, too young to understand, pressed their hands against fevered foreheads, feeling warmth and fragility in the same heartbeat. Traders hid loaves of bread for the starving. Monks tended the dying despite the risk to their own lives. Hope, though fragile, flickered like a lone candle in the darkness, a defiance of the shadow that sought to consume all. The plague, relentless as it was, revealed not only death but the fragile threads that held society together. Families, torn apart, were bound again in grief and compassion. Soldiers, weakened by sickness, discovered courage in small acts of protection for one another. The emperor, impotent in the face of disease, grappled with decisions no man should ever have to make. Who would be saved? Who would be left behind? How to preserve the city when the very air threatened to undo it? Justinian, once a godlike figure in his own mind, understood the bitter truth of mortality. That even empires, built on ambition and conquest, are no stronger than the lives they shelter. By autumn, the streets were littered with the remnants of lives once lived. Gardens grew wild, untended, weeds curling through the cracks in marble. Statues wore moss like shrouds. The city, though still standing, was hollowed out, a monument to both glory and fragility. Yet the people who survived carried on, haunted by absence but determined to endure. They rebuilt, they mourned, they remembered. Constantinople would never be the same, but in its silence, there was a strange, grim poetry, a testament to survival amidst despair. And as winter approached, the shadow of the plague slowly receded, leaving behind a city scarred but breathing, a testament to both the fragility and resilience of human life. Justinian, his body weakened but spirit unbroken, looked over the empire he had dreamed of restoring. The cost had been unbearable, yet the city endured, whispering the promise of renewal. Streets that had known only sorrow now bore witness to quiet steps, cautious yet determined. In the hush of dawn, the wind carried both lament and hope, intertwining them like threads of the same tapestry. The plague of Justinian had struck without warning, taking kings and beggars alike. It had emptied the marketplaces, silenced the choirs, and challenged the gods themselves. Yet through the horror, a story remained, of survival, of fragile courage, of a city that refused to vanish entirely into shadow. Constantinople, scarred and solemn, waited. The empire had lost much, perhaps too much, but the heartbeat of its people, weary yet enduring, promised that life, stubborn and unrelenting, would continue its course. And in the quiet aftermath, a question lingered in the minds of those who survived. How would an empire, shaken to its core by invisible death, rise again from the ashes it had not asked for? The Black Death, silent and invisible, became a catalyst not merely for survival, but for change. The terror of the disease left marks deeper than the scars on flesh. It etched itself into memory, into the collective consciousness of a continent. Nightmares were no longer the domain of the imagination alone. They walked among the living. Artisans carved grotesque masks. Scribes filled manuscripts with images of the skeletal dead. Poets wrote of plague and despair with a poignancy that would echo across centuries. Humanity learned the fragility of its own existence in the face of nature's indifference, and in that reckoning, something new emerged, a recognition that life, fleeting and uncertain, carried within it a potential for transformation. And yet the plague was patient. It came not to destroy in a single strike, but to unravel slowly, to twist the familiar until the living could no longer take comfort in the patterns of the past. Markets would eventually reopen. Cities would slowly repopulate. But the ghosts of the dead lingered in the alleys, in the silence between bells, in the trembling of hands that once held knives or plows. Every new life was shadowed by absence, every celebration tempered by memory. Death had walked among them, and it had not been selective, sparing neither prince nor peasant. By the time the plague receded, Europe had been transformed irreversibly. Entire towns had vanished. Fields lay fallow. Traditions that had once seemed eternal were now fragile, subject to change. And through this devastation, a new rhythm emerged, a subtle shift in the balance of power, in the understanding of mortality, in the recognition that survival was both a gift and a weapon. The Black Death had passed, but its presence lingered, like the echo of a bell in a fog-shrouded valley, reminding all who remained that the world could be unmade and remade in the span of a single lifetime. It is said that the dead outnumbered the living, yet perhaps it is the living who carried the heavier burden, the weight of memory, of absence, of a future reshaped by an unseen hand. And as Europe breathed again, scarred but unbroken, the survivors understood, in a silent, visceral way, that the world had shifted beneath their feet. The castles would endure, the churches would endure, the streets would be repopulate, but the shadow of the plague had etched itself into the very soul of humanity, a reminder that life and death are inextricably entwined, and that even in the darkest suffering, there lies the seed of transformation. In the quiet aftermath, when the smoke cleared and the earth had claimed the dead, those who remained looked at one another with a new awareness, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of loss. They were haunted, yes, but also empowered. The Black Death had broken the old order, and in its absence, a new world began to stir. One where survival was more than endurance, and where fear and hope walked side by side through the emptied streets. The winds of change, born of death, whispered through the ruins, promising that nothing would ever be as it had been, and that from this devastation, the future itself would rise. The year was 1347. A strange, creeping shadow drifted across the waves, borne upon merchant ships that carried the promise of trade, wealth, and distant lands. But hidden among their cargo was death, tiny as a flea, invisible to the eye yet unstoppable in its hunger. Europe did not see it coming. Not the scholars, not the kings, not the peasants laboring in mud-soaked fields. It slipped into the ports, a silent predator, and within weeks, the world would become unrecognizable. In the streets of Messina, the first whispers began. Merchants fell ill in the marketplace, clutching their stomachs, their faces contorted in terror and pain. Rats scuttled unnoticed in the shadows, their bellies swollen, their tiny teeth carriers of an invisible plague. No prayers could halt it, no walls could keep it out. The city's bells tolled incessantly, calling the living to witness the mounting dead, while the dying whispered names that would be forgotten before the sun had set twice. By the time the Black Death crept inland, Florence and Paris had already become cities of silence. Windows shuttered, doors bolted. Streets once alive with laughter and bargaining now echoed only with the groan of those left to wander among the corpses. Children, their eyes wide with confusion, ran barefoot through alleys where the stench of death clung to every corner. The rich hid behind velvet curtains, fearful of the invisible, while the poor lay abandoned, their bodies thrown into mass graves, soil and plague mingling beneath the cold sky. Fear transformed into superstition. Some claimed it was God's wrath. Others whispered of curses and witches. Priests moved through towns in hoods, sprinkling holy water over the afflicted. Yet even their faith seemed powerless. Families turned against one another. Neighbors locked doors to block their own kin. And in the quiet of the night, the wind carried the cries of the dying across deserted streets. Every cough, every fevered moan became a drumbeat of inevitability, the slow march of a world unmade. Yet in the midst of horror, life did not surrender entirely. Those who survived felt an awakening, a trembling awareness that the world they had known was gone. Fields lay untended, workshops empty, and the laborers who remained found themselves suddenly in demand. Lords and nobles, once the arbiters of life and death, now depended on the strength of hands they had once oppressed. The peasantry, scarred and emboldened, discovered a new power in scarcity. Wages rose where before they had been shackled. Bargaining, once unheard of, became survival. Society began to tremble at the foundations of feudal law, the old hierarchies cracking beneath the weight of a plague that respected no crown or title. Amid this chaos, art and thought began to shift. Tombs and cathedrals rose in quiet homage to the dead. Pain became a muse, and from the shadows of despair, literature and reflection took shape. Pain had been universal, inescapable, and yet it also became a bridge between those who survived and the memory of those lost. The Black Death did not simply consume. It reshaped the human spirit, carving new spaces for empathy, fear, and ambition alike. Travelers who had once taken the roads with ease now crossed landscapes scarred by absence. Villages half empty, markets silent, and inns abandoned told the story of a continent in mourning. Smoke rose from countless pyres, carried on wind that smelled of ash and despair. And yet, even in these desolate expanses, the human will endured. Merchants, wary but unbroken, reopened trade routes. Families, their numbers thinned, found ways to reconnect, to hold on to fragile traditions amid the shifting sands of mortality. It was not only bodies that the plague consumed. The social rituals, the certainties of hierarchy, the unquestioned authority of birthright, all of these were undermined. Lords who had expected obedience now encountered resistance. The peasant who had once bowed was now bargaining, negotiating, surviving with a tenacity born of necessity. In this upheaval, seeds of revolution were sown, though they would take generations to bloom fully. The wind howled across the plains of Syria, carrying with it a scent of dust, sweat, and something far more insidious. Soldiers huddled around smoldering fires, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, each cough a tremor of dread that echoed through the encampment. This was not the clashing of swords, nor the thunder of hooves that heralded conquest. It was something quieter, invisible, and merciless. The plague of Amwas had arrived, a silent invader, stripping flesh from the living and shattering the ranks of the once mighty Muslim army. At dawn, the camp was cloaked in a thick, unnatural fog. Shadows lingered longer than they should, stretching over the bodies of those who could no longer rise. Commanders and foot soldiers alike fell without warning. One moment a man wielded a sword with certainty. The next, he shivered violently, lips blue, chest heaving as if the very air had turned to fire. The plague did not discriminate. It took the young and the old, the fierce and the meek, leaving the living to stumble among the dying. In the tents, whispers began to rise, brittle and frightened. Leaders who had once spoken with the certainty of faith now faltered, their voices caught in their throats. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, felt the weight of mortality pressing against his chest, as though the shadow of death itself had taken shape and lingered beside him. Around him, generals fell one by one. Their plans, once meticulous and sharp, disintegrated into panic and despair. With every commander lost, the army fractured, not just in numbers, but in spirit. The cohesion that had carried the Muslim forces across deserts and battlefields now lay in ruins. The plague crept through the camp like a thief in the night. A man would rise to mount his horse, only to collapse mid-step, eyes rolling, breath rattling like chains in an empty hall. Others lay on the ground, clutching their bellies, teeth chattering, as if the earth itself had turned against them. Nurses, soldiers' wives, and those left behind tried to tend to the sick, but their efforts were futile. Each touch could transmit the invisible enemy. Hands that sought to comfort now carried death. The air trembled with grief and fear, and the smell of decay hung like a curtain over the encampment. Amid this horror, a new reality began to emerge. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, a man whose patience and cunning had always been tempered by circumstance, watched the chaos with calculating eyes. He saw what others could not: opportunity in calamity. The army, once a seamless machine, was faltering. Leaders were dying. Authority was unraveling. In this void, he could step forward not merely as a survivor, but as a shepherd for a fractured flock. History would remember him not only for his ambition but for the plague that carved a path straight to power. As the sun climbed higher, the toll of the day became evident. Horse hooves dragged through mud mixed with blood and bile. The cries of the dying mingled with the moans of the grieving, creating a chorus that the desert winds carried across the plains. Yet life, stubborn and relentless, continued in small, almost cruel persistence. Some soldiers, untouched for now, tended the wounded or scavenged what supplies remained. Others wandered in a daze, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. The plague had not just killed, it had unmade certainty, turning men into shadows of themselves. The social fabric outside the camps frayed under similar strain. Villages and towns, once welcoming to conquerors, now recoiled at their presence. Markets grew silent. Water wells were abandoned. Fear spread faster than the disease itself, a contagion of mistrust and isolation. Families mourned quietly in corners of courtyards, unable to tend to all who were ill. Faith, normally a balm against despair, struggled under the weight of so much death. The very idea of divine justice seemed muffled, lost among the groans of the suffering. Even as death reigned, Muawiyah moved decisively. Letters were dispatched, alliances cautiously renewed, promises whispered to those whose loyalty wavered. While the plague felled others indiscriminately, he preserved his strength, cultivating influence with a careful hand. He understood that leadership in the shadow of mortality required more than bravery. It required vision and adaptability. Slowly, the tide shifted, not with a blade, but through survival, strategy, and the perception of order amidst chaos. The loss of so many leaders left a vacuum that no force of arms could fill. Commanders had been pillars of unity, their presence binding the army together. Now, whispers of doubt and fear replaced certainty. Soldiers who once marched in lockstep faltered. Camps that had thrummed with purpose now trembled under the weight of uncertainty. Each day became a test, not of courage, but of endurance. The plague was not just a sickness, it was a crucible, and only those who could navigate its terror would emerge with influence intact. By the third month, the plague of Amwas had altered the very course of the Islamic world. The unity forged in the fires of conquest splintered into factions, each seeking survival, each searching for leadership. Muawiyah, rising like a shadow from the chaos, became the anchor for those left drifting. His ascendancy was not immediate, but inevitable. The battlefield, once determined by swords and shields, had been decided by disease and the human capacity to endure. What was once the natural order of conquest had been rewritten by a virus, unseen yet omnipotent, shaping empires as surely as any general. As the sun set over the Syrian plains, the air thick with smoke and sorrow, the survivors paused. Fires burned low, casting flickering light on the faces of men and women who had seen friends and brothers vanish into silence. A hush fell over the camp, a collective breath held, knowing that life would go on, but not as it had before. Somewhere, Muawiyah watched, a figure of quiet resolve amid ruin, aware that the story of power, faith, and empire had forever shifted under the shadow of the plague of Amwas. The night deepened, and with it came a silence that was both oppressive and reflective. Crickets chirped weakly in the distance. The wind whispered through charred tents, carrying the faint odor of decay. Somewhere a soldier wept, and somewhere else a commander plotted. The world had changed. Empires could fall not only by the sword but by what lay invisible, insidious, and unstoppable. And in the midst of loss, the seeds of the Umayyad Caliphate were sown, a testament to human resilience, cunning, and the strange, terrible power of survival. The plague had claimed countless lives, yet it had done something else. It had rewritten the trajectory of history. What might have been a straightforward path of conquest became a complex web of ambition, tragedy, and opportunity. For those who lived, the air carried a perpetual weight, the memory of the dead, the fragility of life, and the knowledge that empires are not only built on victories but on endurance through suffering. And so, as the night swallowed the camp, the story continued, shaped by the silent, deadly hand of disease, yet guided by those who could see beyond it. The sky darkened in a silence heavier than night, as if the world itself had drawn a slow, trembling breath. The year was 664, and across the British Isles, an invisible terror crept through villages and monasteries alike. A solar eclipse had turned the day into an uncanny twilight, casting shadows that danced like phantoms across the thatched roofs and muddy lanes. Farmers paused mid-stride, livestock froze with lowing halted, and children pressed their faces to the cold earth, sensing the world had shifted. It was a moment pregnant with dread, a silent herald of the calamity to come. No one knew the shape of the disease yet, only its path. It began with whispers. A fever that burned through the body like molten metal, black pustules rising like marks of doom on the skin, stomachs twisting in agony, lungs coughing up bitter blood. The air itself seemed poisoned, heavy with the scent of rot and decay. In some villages, entire families vanished in a single night, leaving doors ajar, fires extinguished, and animals wandering amidst the empty echoes of human life. The plague of 664 was swift, invisible, unrelenting. It moved like a shadow, touching peasants and nobles alike, sparing no one from its quiet, indiscriminate wrath. Among the chaos, the monasteries, those supposed bastions of order and prayer, were not immune. Scribes who once dipped quills in ink now trembled over scrolls, their hands slick with sweat and trembling from fever. The chants that once echoed through stone halls became hollow cries of despair, their resonance punctuated by the coughing and groans of the dying. Monks clutched crucifixes as if their weight alone could ward off the unseen enemy. In some abbeys, the air was thick with the stench of decay. As corpses lay awaiting burial, the bell tolling for one, then another, each ring a drumbeat marking the shrinking heartbeat of a community. The plague did not merely take bodies, it tore at the very fabric of society. Fields went unplowed, markets fell silent, and trade slowed to a hesitant trickle. Lords and kings struggled to maintain authority over lands emptied of laborers and warriors alike. Towns fragmented as fear took root, families abandoning neighbors, suspicion replacing fellowship. Even the sacred trust between ruler and subject was strained. The plague revealed, with merciless clarity, how fragile human order truly was when the veil of mortality was lifted so abruptly. Religion, too, became both shield and crucible. Many saw the disease as divine punishment, a smoldering finger pointing to sins unconfessed, to moral decay lurking in hearts and courts. The eclipse above seemed to confirm these fears, a celestial omen in the midst of earthly suffering. Clergy called for repentance, processions, and prayers. Yet for every hope invoked, despair deepened. The synod convened amid the fevered whispers of the dying, clerics debating remedies and moral explanations, trying to anchor the flock in a storm of uncertainty. Some preached penitence and fasting. Others turned inward, wrestling with doubts that perhaps even their prayers had limits against such relentless death. Villagers, too, wrestled with invisible choices. Should they flee, abandoning home and hearth, or stay, risking the certainty of infection? Fathers and mothers faced the excruciating agony of watching children waste away, skin mottled, eyes sunken, until the vital spark was snuffed like a candle in the wind. Husbands and wives clutched each other in corridors and huts, seeking warmth, comfort, and the illusion of protection against a specter they could neither see nor fight. Fear became a constant companion, threading through the daily acts of survival. Fetching water, carrying wood, tending to animals, all now shadowed by the dread of invisible contagion. The plague's touch was indiscriminate, yet profoundly human in its consequences. Nobles fell in their halls, scribes in their chambers, and peasants on the muddy roads. Communities became ghost towns, punctuated by smoke from solitary fires and the groaning of those too weak to rise. Some tried to bury their dead in haste, mass graves dug under the pall of night, shovels striking earth heavy with sorrow. Others left bodies unclaimed, believing the touch of the dead could not bring further harm. Yet each morning, the weight of absence became a tangible force pressing against walls, doors, and hearts. Amid the horror, moments of human fragility and courage glimmered. A monk would hold a fevered child, whispering prayers between coughs. A widow, face streaked with tears and soot, would gather what little food remained to feed those too weak to rise. Even in a world surrendering to sickness, the bonds of compassion, though frayed, refused to break entirely. It was a testament not only to suffering but to the resilience of a people who refused to surrender their humanity entirely to darkness. And yet, the plague of 664 was more than a story of illness. It was an event that reshaped belief and governance alike. The Synod of Whitby, already convened to resolve ecclesiastical disputes, found its urgency sharpened by the shadow of the epidemic. The lines between politics and piety blurred as leaders sought to unify, to impose order, to interpret the plague in ways that could give shape to an unshapable force. Faith became both shield and weapon, morality intertwined with survival, and every prayer carried the weight of life and death. By the time the fever abated, leaving survivors to count themselves among the living, the world had changed irreversibly. Villages once vibrant now whispered of absence, the familiar sounds of daily life replaced with silence or mourning. The plague had revealed the precariousness of human civilization, the fragility of authority, and the terrifying power of nature, and perhaps, in some dark corner, the divine. Yet within the devastation lingered something stubborn. The determination to rebuild, to honor the lost, to mark the event in memory and ritual, ensuring that even as disease reshaped life, it could not erase the human story from the soil it touched. The eclipse, a fleeting shadow across the sky, passed as all celestial events do, yet its echo remained in human hearts. The plague of 664 left a mark beyond numbers, beyond death. It left an imprint on belief, on community, on the fragile trust between people and the world around them. It reminded the living that life is fleeting, that mortality is ever near, and that even in the darkest hours, the glimmer of human courage and connection endures. And as the survivors emerged, cautious and weary, they walked among empty fields and silent monasteries, their eyes carrying the memory of what had been lost. Each footstep stirred the ashes of homes and hearths, a reminder that history is not only written in victories and kings, but also in the quiet suffering of ordinary lives. The shadow of the plague of 664 lingered long after the fever broke, a silent testament to the entwining of disease, faith, and human endurance. A story whispered across generations, echoing in every corner where loss had once walked. A fog of unease rolled across the cobbled streets of Europe. Lanterns flickered in the early dusk, casting quivering shadows against stone walls. And in the alleys, whispers of an invisible terror traveled faster than the evening wind. Some called it the French disease, others the Great Pox. Yet no name could capture the horror it brought. Faces once familiar were now grotesque masks of suffering. Flesh decayed, sores blackened, and the screams of the afflicted were muffled beneath the veneer of polite society. In every town and village, fear coiled like smoke, and no soul felt safe from its silent, creeping touch. The disease arrived not quietly, but as a herald of a new, ruthless age. Merchants, soldiers, and explorers returning from distant shores carried with them not only gold and spices, but an invisible scourge. Ports throbbed with commerce, yet every ship that docked was a vessel of plague. Armies, once symbols of power and honor, became vectors of death. The battlefield no longer ended with the clash of steel. It lingered in bedchambers, in taverns, in the quiet chambers of homes where fear whispered from the shadows. Families recoiled from one another, and strangers became enemies by default. Trust, that fragile thread of civilization, frayed under the weight of suspicion. To contract the disease was to be marked in ways that could not be concealed. Faces and bodies transformed grotesquely, and the mirror became an enemy. Men and women saw their flesh rebel, abscesses spreading like maps of unknown lands across skin once tender and smooth. Pain became a companion, unyielding and intimate, a reminder that no corner of life was untouched. Yet even more brutal than the body's betrayal was society's gaze. Those afflicted were shunned, driven from homes, abandoned in the streets to beg for scraps or mercy. The church offered prayers but little solace. Physicians prescribed concoctions that tasted of bitter earth and despair, and often of nothing at all. In the crowded courts of kings and the candlelit halls of monasteries, rumors swirled faster than the disease itself. Nobles whispered of secret liaisons. Soldiers of battles fought not with swords but with bodies. Syphilis became a specter of shame, a symbol of moral decay as much as physical suffering. Art itself turned its gaze to the epidemic, capturing the horror in darkened engravings, in grotesque faces etched with fear and disease. Poets and playwrights wove the illness into their tales, threading through their lines a tension that mirrored the society around them. Every stanza, every brushstroke, reflected the fragile, trembling humanity that clung to life even as the world around it seemed to crumble. Yet even in its cruelty, the disease revealed the unspoken truths of a changing Europe. Travel and war, ambition and greed, carried the seeds of human fragility. Cities grew crowded, armies moved with unprecedented speed, and the boundaries between nations blurred. The same voyages that brought back knowledge and riches also brought this relentless intruder. Europe had never faced a threat so intimately tied to its own expansion, so intertwined with the very lifeblood of its ambitions. In a cruel irony, progress carried poison. Exploration sowed both empire and epidemic. Doctors experimented in dim chambers, their tools glinting faintly in torchlight, as they sought remedies that often made the patient weaker than the disease itself. Mercury ointments, purgatives, and painful surgeries promised salvation but delivered only more agony. Some practitioners whispered of mysticism, of divine punishment, while others documented, meticulously, the anatomy of infection, the path of sores, the decay of tissue. Their records, written in cramped, trembling hands, would later become the foundation for modern medicine. But in that moment, Knowledge offered little comfort to those living each day under the shadow of the great pox. Communities fractured. Families hid their suffering behind closed doors, afraid of shame more than death. Widows and widowers walked among the living like ghosts, their bodies betraying what society dared not name. Children were abandoned, their cries lost in the vast, uncaring silence of fear. Even love became a dangerous act, a risk measured not in hearts but in bodies, in the quiet judgment that lingered behind every glance. Desire itself became a weapon, fraught with peril, and intimacy a gamble with fate. The disease, relentless and indiscriminate, reshaped the moral landscape of Europe, questioned loyalty and honor, tested faith and resilience. The old rules of society faltered under the weight of panic and secrecy. Laws were enacted, some cruel, some compassionate, yet all were inadequate to contain what spread like wildfire through the veins of a continent. In some cities, quarantines isolated the ill, leaving them to starve behind locked doors. In others, charred pyres rose, a grim testament to desperation and the human need for control. Fear became governance, suspicion became law, and the line between justice and cruelty blurred in the smoke of suffering. Amidst the despair, there were moments of quiet defiance. Some communities tended the sick with trembling hands, offering water, bread, and whispered prayers. Families, against reason and fear, refused to abandon one another. Clerics spoke of mercy and forgiveness, of love that could survive even in plague. And in the shadows of courts and monasteries, scribes recorded the unfolding tragedy, capturing not only the horrors but also the courage that persisted in human hearts. These faint lights of hope glimmered against the relentless darkness, reminders that even amidst shame and disfigurement, humanity sought to endure. Syphilis did not merely afflict bodies. It reshaped Europe's imagination. Pain, shame, and survival became intertwined with culture and thought. Literature, art, and music absorbed the epidemic's lessons, embedding the fear of contagion and the fragility of flesh into the collective consciousness. It altered how people approached desire, marriage, and morality. It forced conversations about responsibility, secrecy, and the vulnerability of the body in ways that would resonate for centuries. What had begun as a physical illness became a mirror reflecting societal anxieties, ambitions, and failings. And yet, the disease's most profound legacy was invisible, woven into the silence between the living and the dead. Every abandoned alley, every whispered warning, every hurried prayer carried the memory of those lost. Europe would carry these scars, not only in its laws and medicine, but in the tremors of its cultural soul. The epidemic became a teacher, harsh and merciless, revealing truths that the swords of kings could never expose. The precariousness of life, the limits of control, and the resilience required to endure what the world, unbidden, had brought upon them. As the sun set over the stone battlements of distant cities, casting long shadows into quiet streets, a question lingered in the minds of the living. What price does ambition demand when it carries death in its wake? The echoes of the great pox whispered through the corridors of power, through the hovels of the poor, through the quiet chambers of those too afraid to speak. Europe would move forward, carrying both the wealth of conquest and the weight of disease. And in that movement, a new awareness was born, a recognition that progress and peril walk hand in hand, and that the faint, trembling hope of survival must be nurtured in every generation. The year was 1629, and the air hung thick with foreboding, heavy as wet wool pressed against the skin. Northern Italy, a land of gilded canals and sunlit piazzas, now shivered under an invisible siege. Milan, Venice, Mantua, cities that had once echoed with the laughter of markets and the clatter of hooves, became silent theaters of death. From the bustling docks to the cobbled streets, a strange stillness had settled, broken only by the groan of the afflicted and the bell tolls that marked yet another soul claimed by the plague. It arrived as a shadow, insidious and patient. Merchants returning from distant markets carried more than goods. They brought the weight of pestilence in their boots, in their breath, in the dark folds of their clothes. Soldiers, marching to the drumbeats of the 30 Years' War, became unwitting heralds of decay. The clash of armies did not only spill blood upon the battlefield, it scattered disease like seeds upon fertile soil. Towns once fortified against invaders found themselves defenseless against this silent enemy. In Milan, the plague crept like smoke through narrow alleyways. Families barricaded themselves behind shutters, listening to the distant wails of neighbors carried away on carts. The rich and the poor, the noble and the servant, were equalized by fever and swelling buboes. Markets emptied. The grand cathedral squares became ghostly expanses where pigeons walked unchallenged, and the scent of disinfecting vinegar could not mask the stench of suffering. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew the scale of the calamity yet to unfold. Venice, that jewel of the lagoon, fell under a different kind of torment. Gondolas, once symbols of romance and commerce, now drifted silently past shuttered windows, each one carrying the diseased or the dead. The canals, reflecting the dying light of late afternoon, became mirrors of sorrow. Merchants haggled no more. Their voices were replaced by the creaking of wooden oars and the lamentations of those who rowed them. The Serenissima, proud and untouchable in its maritime glory, discovered that no fortress of stone could keep out an enemy that moved unseen, breathed silently, and struck without warning. The plague's cruelty was not measured merely in numbers, though they were staggering. In Mantua, nearly half the population vanished within months. Children slept beside empty beds where parents had once sung lullabies. Apprentices swept workshops now deserted. The echo of laughter was replaced by coughing fits in dimly lit rooms. Fear became a currency more valuable than gold, traded in whispers between neighbors who dared not touch one another. Families abandoned the sick, churches overflowed with the desperate, and civic leaders trembled at the impossible choice between quarantine and economic survival. And yet, in this darkness, the human spirit, frail, stubborn, and luminous, persisted. Women carried water to doors they dared not cross. Men wrapped their loved ones in blankets, shielding them from the worst winds that carried infection. Some scribes recorded events in meticulous script, hoping that ink could preserve the truth when memory failed. A lone monk prayed over the bodies left in the streets, his voice rising above the tolling bells, a fragile hymn against the roar of death. The plague did not discriminate, yet the responses it elicited were profoundly human. Acts of courage, despair, and mercy intertwined like the roots of a gnarled tree. The war outside the cities only worsened matters. Troops crossed borders, leaving trails of devastation in villages they passed, spreading famine and disease in equal measure. The political machinations of princes and generals seemed irrelevant to the suffering they left in their wake. For the common people, the war and the plague were inseparable. One an extension of the other, a force that turned soldiers into carriers and towns into tombs. Trade routes that once carried silk and spice now ferried infection, as if the land itself conspired with fate to amplify human suffering. Hospitals, when they existed, became chambers of terror. Sheets soaked with sweat and blood were stacked in corners. The moans of the dying became part of the daily rhythm. Physicians, often powerless, wore masks filled with aromatic herbs, their attempts at protection seeming almost ritualistic against an enemy they could neither see nor name. The plague spared no age, no status, no creed. The powerful fell alongside the poor, abbots and cardinals, merchants and artisans, All were humbled by the same relentless hand. In every city square, a grim lesson was etched into the stone. Mortality is the great equalizer. Economic life faltered as swiftly as human bodies. Fields went untilled, shops remained shuttered, and trade caravans halted on roads now haunted by fear. Starvation crept alongside fever, a silent accomplice to disease. Families pawned heirlooms to buy bread and oil, only to find their coins meaningless when death claimed the wage earner. The social fabric, once taut with routine and commerce, frayed into isolation and suspicion. Villages walled themselves off. Neighbors eyed one another as potential threats, their humanity corroded by necessity and terror. Yet amidst this suffering, moments of startling poignancy emerged. A nurse, her hands cracked and bleeding, soothed a child with soft murmurs. A father, delirious with fever, clasped his daughter's hand one last time. A stranger shared bread with the abandoned, a small rebellion against the silence that engulfed the streets. These brief sparks of empathy illuminated the darkened cities, reminders that even in the shadow of death, humanity persisted. Every act of care, no matter how small, became a defiance of the plague itself, a testament to resilience amidst despair. As the year waned, the toll became almost unimaginable. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their absence felt in empty homes, silent workshops, and the echo of abandoned churches. The Italian plague of 1629 left scars not just upon the body, but upon society itself. Traditions were interrupted, economies destabilized, and families fragmented. Cities that had once glittered with wealth and culture were now monuments to loss, their splendor overshadowed by the memory of suffering. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, life began its slow return. Streets once littered with refuse and despair now saw cautious steps. Markets reopened, though with a wary tension. The bells rang again, tentative, almost apologetic, for the silence they had presided over. But the shadow of the plague lingered, etched into the collective memory like a permanent stain on the city walls. It served as a haunting reminder that disease, though invisible, could exploit every fault line of human society, political, social, and military alike, and magnify the consequences of ambition, pride, and negligence. As northern Italy began to stir with the fragile pulse of recovery, one could still see the traces of what had been lost. A gondola gliding past a shuttered palazzo, the echo of a cough in a once bustling piazza, the wind carrying whispers of names now silenced forever. The plague had come, unseen, and it had spared no one, yet it also left behind an indelible mark on history. A story of fear, courage, and the fragile beauty of human life pressed against the inexorable weight of mortality. The cities waited, patient and scarred, as the world beyond continued its relentless march. And though the streets would fill again with the clatter of life, the memory of the plague would remain, a shadow lurking in the corners, reminding every passerby that survival is fragile, and that in every moment of peace, the specter of chaos waits just beyond the horizon. The air hung heavy over Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, thick with heat and the restless murmur of the city. Streets, narrow and cobbled, shimmered under the sun, yet they were not empty. Something strange, something terrible had taken hold. It began with a woman, a single figure swaying, almost imperceptibly at first, in the marketplace. But soon the rhythm of her body drew the attention of another, and then, as if some unseen pulse had gripped the heart of the city itself, dozens began to dance. It was no celebration, no laughter filled the square. The movement was wild, uncontrollable. Feet pounded the stones like war drums, arms flailed as though in silent protest, faces twisted in grimaces of exertion and panic. Some cried out. Others seemed mute, possessed by a force they could neither name nor resist. Onlookers recoiled, stepping back in horror. Windows were thrown open. Mothers clutched children close. Yet the dancers continued, their bodies bending under a rhythm only they could hear, each step taking them further from reason, further from the world they once knew. The city's authorities were baffled. Priests prayed over the afflicted, sprinkling holy water, chanting invocations, yet nothing broke the spell. Physicians inspected the dancers, measuring pulse, examining muscles, searching for fever or poison, but the usual explanations offered no comfort. Streets were cordoned, but the dancing did not cease. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again, as if drawn by some terrible, irresistible magnet. One by one, some danced to their deaths, their hearts and lungs giving way to the relentless demand of their own bodies. The square became a theater of agony and bewilderment, a grim carnival that no one could stop. Speculation swirled as thickly as the dust on the roads. Some whispered that the devil had cursed the city, punishing the sins of Strasbourg with this grotesque affliction. Others murmured of Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers and sufferers alike. His spirit enraged, his fingers weaving through the souls of the living. There were those who feared poison, ergot, a fungus that grew on rye, known to drive men mad, to twist their minds and bodies into unnatural convulsions. And yet, the dancing did not discriminate. Rich and poor, young and old, all were swept into its cruel rhythm. The human toll was more than visible in the tired, gasping bodies that littered the streets. It was etched in the faces of those who had not danced, in the eyes of the frightened children, in the whispers of neighbors who feared that the plague might leap from the streets into their homes. Hunger gnawed at the city as markets emptied, commerce slowed, and the usual cadence of daily life faltered beneath the spell of this inexplicable frenzy. Fear became a palpable presence, stalking the alleyways, waiting in doorways. Strasbourg was alive with a strange, anxious energy, a city at once vibrant and terrified. And yet, even in the midst of chaos, the city's response was a study in human desperation and contradiction. Authorities hired musicians, hoping that more structured music might channel the dancing into less harmful forms. They built stages, expecting to isolate the afflicted, to somehow contain the invisible force that drove their bodies. But the dancers ignored boundaries. The music only seemed to pull them further, the rhythm calling their bodies like a siren to the sea. Onlookers, drawn by morbid curiosity, lined the streets, witnesses to a spectacle that balanced precariously between awe and horror. Historians would later puzzle over the event, poring over city records and eyewitness accounts, trying to find meaning in the madness. They would debate the cause: mass hysteria born of famine, religious fervor, and fear, a psychological contagion that spread through suggestion and anxiety, or some strange chemical madness imposed by the land itself. Yet even centuries later, the truth remains elusive. What is certain is the emotional resonance of those days, the terror, the desperation, the thin line between life and death. The dancing was not merely physical. It was a manifestation of the mind's fragility, of society's capacity for panic, of the mysterious ways the human body can betray its own reason. Amid the panic, there were moments of piercing humanity. Neighbors tried to pull dancers aside, lay them in cool doorways, press water to their lips. Priests moved among the afflicted with trembling hands, offering absolution and hope. Some dancers, caught in the thrall, sang prayers aloud in fragments, their voices ragged, their faith mingling with fear. In these moments, the city seemed to stand at the intersection of the divine and the damned, where ritual and superstition, medicine and madness, collided in the streets like clashing swords. The plague eventually waned, as all things do, leaving behind an exhausted city and fragmented memories. Those who survived carried the shadow of that summer with them. Muscle aches that lingered for weeks, dreams haunted by relentless steps, minds imprinted with the chaos they had witnessed. Families mourned the dead, while others questioned what invisible force had driven their friends and neighbors to such extremes. Strasbourg returned to its rhythms, but a tremor of unease remained, a quiet understanding that life could turn inexplicably against you, that the body and the mind could rebel in ways no one could fully explain. In retrospect, the dancing plague is more than an oddity or a historical curiosity. It is a lens into the fragile equilibrium between fear and reason, health and hysteria. It reveals how the mind, when pressed by hunger, stress, or belief, can erupt into physical catastrophe. It shows the delicate interplay between society and the individual, how panic can become infectious, how mystery can become a weapon against the stability of daily life. And it reminds us, in haunting clarity, that the human experience is never merely a story of survival. It is a story of endurance in the face of forces unseen, of communities trembling under the weight of the inexplicable, and of bodies that can betray themselves in the most public of ways. As twilight fell over Strasbourg, the city would never quite forget the sound of feet beating against stone, the flickering shadows of limbs twisted by a rhythm no one could control, the fevered stares of dancers lost to an unseen compulsion. The streets returned to quiet, yet in the hush, one could almost hear a memory lingering in the stones, a whisper of madness dancing just beyond the edge of reason, waiting to remind the living that the mind and the body are never entirely their own. And so, the story of the dancing plague drifts into history, a haunting echo of human vulnerability and resilience, a reminder that in the most ordinary of streets, under the most ordinary of suns, the extraordinary can take hold. And when it does, nothing, not faith, nor fear, nor authority, can stop it.